Hello and welcome to our webinar, Meeting Talent Strategy Goals with HR Analytics. I'm Martha Mangelsdorf, Director of Strategic Communications at the MIT Sloan School of Management's Good Companies, Good Jobs initiative, and I'll be your moderator today. This event will be recorded and will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. In addition, today's slides will be made available to attendees. We welcome your questions for our speaker today. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the chat box in the lower corner of your screen. Or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #MITSMREvent. We'll answer as many questions as time permits. If you are having audio difficulties while listening via computer, please call in via telephone instead, or check the help link in the upper part of your console. Our speaker today is David Harcourt, Associate Manager of Employee Insights at Yum Brands. Our thanks go out to SAS for their sponsorship of this webinar. And now, on to our presentation, Meeting Talent Strategy Goals with HR Analytics. David, tell us about your experience with HR Analytics at Yum Brands.
Thanks, Martha, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Like she said, my name's David. I work at Yum Brands. For those of you who don't know what Yum Brands is, we own 3 great restaurant brands that you probably have heard of, KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell, with about 45,000 stores across 135 countries. So pretty big. So this topic of analytics and HR is really important. It's been around for a decade or more, but it's really exploded in the last few years. And I'm not going to tell you about the state of the industry or why it's so important. What I'm really going to talk about today is how it's done, specifically how we've done it at Yum Brands. We got started around 3 years ago on this initiative. And to be real honest, looking back, we didn't know what we were doing. And there wasn't a lot of material out there. A lot of the existing literature was, again, around why that's important and a lot of high-level thinking, but there wasn't a lot around how to actually do it. But we've learned a lot of the lessons along the way. And this presentation is more or less the resource I wish I had when I got started. So let's get started. First of all, data. I think we can all agree that data are important in any analytics strategy. I think analytics without data is kind of like trying to run the Winter Olympics without snow. It just can't be done. And there are a lot of different sources out there. You have your HRIS system, so your PeopleSoft, your Workday, where you keep all of your payroll, workforce data. You have your talent management, where you have performance ratings, goals, results, those kinds of things, and a lot of other types of assessments, financial data, some external benchmarks, and all of those things. And each of these data sources probably has, or at least they advertise, some form of analytics capability. If you go into your HR system, there's probably an analytics tab where you can run some reports and dashboards. And these different vendors will prepare some analysis for you. But where I think you can really make a difference is bringing all of those data sources together and really finding some relationships between the different disparate sources of data. And a lot of this is going to require at the outset some relationship building, because all of these data sources are hosted by lots of different people. You have your IT team that houses most of the major stuff, external vendors, some of them may even be spreadsheets on someone's computer. So you have to go out and talk to people, let them know what you're doing, and once you start building those relationships, getting that data will be easier, and the whole process can get started. Some other things to think about when you're dealing with data. First of all, data governance. So that's making sure that the data you're collecting, the data you're analyzing are being used responsibly. making sure that the data are accurate and clean. And I know that there's no such thing as perfectly clean data, but as clean as accurate as possible. And you're going to be dealing with some sensitive information too, things like social security numbers and health and wellness data. So you want to make sure that the people working with that data have the proper training, whether that's HIPAA training or other sort of sensitivity or governance training about how to handle personal information, sensitive information like that. And then also data security. A lot of the HR analytics vendors and solutions are cloud-based now. And your IT team gets a little nervous when you start moving sensitive information from outside of their firewall up to the cloud and then back down. So you want to make sure that they're looped into the process as well, make sure they're comfortable with all of the safeguards that are in place from different vendors, and just make sure that you're not leaving yourself exposed. And a lot of these same protections would apply to most any analytics practice, consumer insights, for instance. And when you go down this path, it's natural to kind of think of the two, consumer insights and HR analytics, as kind of similar. Even the title I have, employee insights, is a play on the title of consumer insights. And I think that's a natural connection there. But there are some certain distinctions that have to be made. Primarily, you can't treat employees the same way a business treats consumers. That relationship between business and consumer and employee and employer are fundamentally different. Employers have much more say over the health, wealth, and happiness of their employees than businesses ever do about their consumers. And employees are going to be naturally wary of efforts to collect data about them, to use data to make decisions. So you just have to be careful about that. So how do you navigate that complex situation? First of all, you want to be transparent. You don't want to have the reputation as the NSA of HR. And for our international audience, the NSA is that nice government agency in the US that was discovered to be collecting a lot of information around phone calls and other stuff, and it got a really bad reputation for being secretive and not being forthcoming with how they're using the data. So when you go to employees and say you're running an assessment, tell them this is how we're going to use the data. Here's who's going to get a copy of the results, and here's how it's going to be used, and then stick to that. As long as you're upfront with employees, they'll get a better understanding of how it's being used. And you want to communicate with them, not just communicating from a transparency perspective, but also showing them the value of these efforts to collect and analyze data. For instance, if you're running an employee engagement survey and you get the results back, go back to the employees and say, here's what the results were, and here's what we're going to do. Here, you said you didn't like this about the job, so we're going to do this about it. So they can actually see that there are positive implications to all of this, that it's not a punitive thing. And for instance, if you're running a new training course for new supervisors and bosses, you can go to them and say, look, these behaviors are the most effective when you're starting out as a new boss or supervisor. And we know that because from our own data, the most effective bosses do X, Y, and Z. So you can really start showing the value and marketing the value of these efforts. And then whenever you can, make it an opt-in scenario, kind of like Facebook. You don't have to join Facebook. You're not always 100% certain what they're doing with your information, but for the most part, the onus is on you the user to agree with that and opt in. But that can be a little tricky in the employee-employer scenario, because sometimes voluntary is not actually voluntary. You've probably heard the phrase voluntold. That's kind of the feeling you get when an employer asks for something like this, that yes, it's technically voluntary, but there may be you may feel undue pressure to comply. So that's really it. You want to be sensitive to the concerns of the employees. You want to listen to them, and you want to communicate with them. So once you figure out your data strategy, you really want to figure out what you want to work on. And it's really important to align your analytics practice with your HR strategy. There's a lot of questions to ask that will get you closer to that answer. One of the biggest ones is, what are your executives worried about? What's keeping them up at night? Is it attrition? Are they losing good people? Is it succession planning? Are they worried that if the top leadership were to leave in the next 2 years, that there wouldn't be enough people in the bench to support them? You can also look at this from a financial perspective. Where are we losing money? Again, are we having to retrain people that come in that are replacing those who we've lost? Are we having an engagement problem with a lack of productivity? Or are we having to hire external talent because we can't train the right people to be ready for those next big roles? So you can look at it from a financial perspective as well. And then also, what is your competitive advantage? Around here, we take pride in our strong corporate culture. We want to be a place where people want to come to work. So it would make sense that we use data to support that initiative. And after asking all these questions myself when we got started, this really pointed us towards a talent management and organizational development focus. Like I said, I'm part of the parent company. We let the brands kind of do what's right for their store level employees at the restaurants. My big focus is on our corporate population, so the several thousand corporate employees across the globe. And we want to make sure that we're not just retaining people, but we're engaging people, that we're developing people, that we're selecting people who have potential to get to the next level, the future leaders of the company. Those are the kinds of things we settled upon when we got this. Now, it doesn't mean we don't go back and do some ad hoc stuff for, say, compensation and benefits or talent acquisition, but the big focus of the work we do here is around our talent strategy. So once you get your strategy set, you have to go pick project to work on. And you want to pick the right project. So every project you work on could be plotted somewhere along this chart, where you have the value of the findings and the project, along with the effort it requires to execute that project. So when you're going through, you can go ahead and just mark off this quadrant over here. You don't want to waste your time with the low value, high effort projects. Those are just a waste of time. Similarly, on the opposite corner, you have your projects that are high value that don't take a lot of effort. These are the projects I call unicorns. They're rare and beautiful creatures, but they typically only show up in academic case studies. So what you're left with, to use a baseball terminology, are bunts, base hits, and home runs. You can either do little projects that don't take a lot of work and don't deliver a lot of value, or you can spend a whole lot of time trying to execute big work. And when you're starting out, you don't necessarily want to shoot for the moon. You want to have some impact, but you don't need to change the world right away. So what does that right first project look like? You want to start small. You want to utilize the data sources that you already have. You probably know that the biggest part of any analytics project is gathering data, cleaning data, making sure you have everything right. The actual process of doing the analysis is at sometimes even an afterthought. So a good way to get a quick win on the board is to use data that you already have. Don't go trying to collect a whole bunch of extra data. And make sure that your timeline is relatively short. You don't want to go 6 months to a year without any big results. And like I said, you don't need to change the world, but make sure that the impact on the business is clear. So why should we start small? Well, there's some good reasons for that. Like I said, you want to get some results. You want to get some quick wins on the board. This initiative to bring analytics to HR has probably come with a sizable investment in people, in technology. A lot of money has been spent on this. So the people who spent that money are going to want to see value sooner rather than later. So if you go dark for 6 months or a year without any big results, they're going to start getting nervous. It's also good to gauge the appetite for analytics. It's one thing to say that you want to get into this game, but it's another to actually get the results and execute on them. So you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page regarding that. And then your first project, you're going to make mistakes. It's just the way things go. So you want to make little mistakes instead of big ones. If you, we have a saying that fail fast and learn from it. You don't want to sink a bunch of costs and resources into a project that doesn't end up working out. And another thing on the impact of a project. It's very important, and it seems obvious, but you'd be surprised. So I have two dashboards up here. One is a flight tracker that you get on your flight when you're going across the country, around the world. It shows you all of those nice little details about where you're going, how fast you're going, how high you are, when you're going to get there. The other one is a run tracking app on your phone where it shows you basically the same things. It shows you how fast you're going, where you're going, how long it's taken you to get there. But I would ask you to consider that from the point of view of the audience. What is your audience going to do with this information? The audience for that flight tracker is a passenger on that airplane. As a passenger on that airplane, I can't do anything with this information. It's not like I can go up to the pilot and say, we should really be going 37,000 feet instead of 38,000 feet. You just can't do that. But when you look at the Run Tracker app, I can do something as the person running. I can do something with that information. I can see if my pace is too fast or too slow, and I can make adjustments on the fly. And the other thing to think about is the shelf life of the information. How much shelf life does that flight tracker app have? Once I'm off that plane and I go get my bag, I couldn't tell you a single thing about any of the information I saw on that flight tracker because it no longer has any relevance to my life whatsoever. But on that run tracker, I can chart my runs over time. I can see how I've improved. I can see where my pain points are, where I struggle, and I can make adjustments based on that. So two dashboards that are well put together. They show a lot of information. They're both interesting. That's not to say that I don't love watching that flight tracker while I'm on the plane. But from a point of view of usefulness, one clearly is more impactful than the other. So that might seem obvious. Make sure that you can do something with your results. But this is the natural way that that analytics projects work out if you're not careful. Everyone gets in a room and they ask a lot of questions. They say, wouldn't it be cool if we knew this? Or I would love to know, who's doing this or what's going on with that. So you write down all those questions and you go track down the answers and you deliver a solution. And then once you have that solution, then you start looking for applications of that solution. You start trying to find the problems that those solutions will solve. And that's not the most efficient way to do that. The way you should be doing it is going in with the problem. We're losing people here, or we have a sticking point in the organization that people get stuck at this level. Then you can start asking the questions of how will data answer this question, and how will knowing the answer to that question change things. Once you've built up that background, then delivering the solution is much easier because you already have a place where that solution fits in. And while we're on the topic of picking projects and working through them, I would caution that sometimes simpler is better. Now, a lot of you have probably seen a chart like this. If you've read a single analytics white paper in your life, you've probably seen this chart where at one end you have descriptive analytics. That's your dashboards, your summary statistics, your percentages of turnover, things like that. They're not as complicated and they don't have much impact. Then you have your predictive modeling where you have a target variable that you're trying to predict, and then in the future, based on different predicting values, you can come up with a predicted value. And then prescriptive, where you can actually take that a step further and identify solutions to problems based on the analysis. So when I got my start, I had the capability to do predictive analytics. I could run logistic regressions and I could make decision trees, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily the best place to start. It's kind of like, say you're climbing a ladder. The natural way to climb a ladder is you put your foot on that first rung and then you take the second step and so on. You don't take a flying leap towards the middle of the ladder in order to save a few steps. And that's kind of what I did getting started. So this is one of the first slides of results that I showed the leadership team. And the numbers themselves aren't that important, but I thought it was a pretty straightforward decision tree talking about high potential talent and some of the predictors that go into whether or not that person is a high potential in our organization. So when I presented this, I realized that I'd never shown anyone a decision tree before. People weren't familiar with what a decision tree was or what it did. And that meeting is not the meeting where you try to explain what a decision tree is. And we hadn't talked about what it would look like to deploy a predictive model into an existing process. So I hadn't done enough work to bring people along in order to be able to present something like this. Now let's contrast that with a much simpler analytic approach that had a lot bigger impact. So we have this executive assessment where prospective employees who are at the executive level take this assessment before we interview them, and they get results on 5 different competencies that the hiring manager sees, and they can use that information to pick out the right candidates to hire. So I looked at, of those 5 competencies, and I looked at people who we hired that ended up being a high potential. So they ended up getting promoted several times through the years, versus those who hired on and didn't really advance their career that much. And we saw that our high potential leaders were scoring higher than their peers in these 3 competencies. Okay, simple enough. So then I went back and looked for those we hired versus those we didn't. So for that person that we hired, did they score the highest in their slate of candidates? So the other people that were vying for the same job, did they score the highest in all of those competencies? So that percentage on the side is the percentage of people who we ended up hiring scoring the best out of their slate of candidates. Now remember, these are the ones we want, the high potential leaders. And in 2 of the 3 competencies, it was under 50% of them scored the highest out of in those categories. Here's the people who we tended to hire, those that scored higher in the 2 competencies that weren't as predictive of high potential. So we're able to take this result and kind of retool the assessment and bring this knowledge to the people making those decisions and telling them that if you want high potential leaders, you should really focus on the first 3 competencies when you're looking at the assessments. Now you'll note that I didn't do any analytics wizardry here. I did some pretty basic t-tests and some other statistical tests to prove my point. But what I did was I took 2 disparate data sources and I kind of married them together, and I looked at things a little bit differently than the traditional way of looking at them. And you were able to get a pretty good result at the end. Now, that wasn't, that's not always the case. Sometimes the more complex approach will give you a better result, but sometimes it's easy to overlook the simple stuff because anyone can do that. But sometimes that's where you can get the most bang for your buck. But one place where I do like to go in a little deeper is around unstructured data and text analytics, because these are very rich sources of data. Sometimes we run into an issue where we don't have the millions of rows or billions of rows that other industries have. HR data tends to move a little slower than the other industries. And so much of the employment experience is qualitative versus quantitative. So this is where you can get a lot of context around some of the issues around employment, is through what people are actually saying. And it'll uncover issues that you didn't know about, because when you give people an open forum to talk about whatever, they tend to bring up things that you didn't know about. And most importantly, it'll answer the questions that you didn't know to ask. One good example of this was we were running an employee engagement survey a few years back, and I was taking the anonymized comments about what would make this place a better place to work. And this theme of Friday year-round kept cropping up, and it caused me to scratch my head a little bit. So I went in and dug a little deeper. And what people were saying was, we like having half-day Fridays in the summer, because that was an existing policy that over the summer you could get out of work at 1 in the afternoon. What if we made that a year-round policy? And enough people were saying this that it was showing up in some of the analysis I was doing. So I was able to take that data point to the leaders and say, look, a lot of people are saying this, and we had already kind of been thinking that way, but this kind of made that argument a little bit stronger. And now that's a policy that's been implemented across the globe, is a year-round half-day Friday, and it's great. So where do you look for unstructured data? There are actually a surprising amount of sources of unstructured data. So say attrition is the problem you're dealing with. You can look at exit interviews. What are people saying in those exit interviews where you could come up with some common themes? Also with surveys, whether it's an engagement survey or a 360-degree feedback survey, anything like that. There's a lot of rich data contained within those surveys, as long as you're, of course, making those anonymous. And then also your enterprise social networks, your Yammers and such. Now, I haven't found a good full-scale use for mining the data within the social networks, just because you run into a little bit of selection bias with the types of people that tend to gravitate towards using social media. But we have used it a little bit. We kind of run some mini surveys without actually surveying people. We ask some questions from a leader, and then people respond to that question. Then we take some of those responses to inform some decisions. So there is some value to looking through that as well. And then the specific techniques that are used in text analytics. Obviously, you have your word counts and word clouds. Those are pretty low value in my opinion, but the good news is anyone can pretty much do them. You can get a little bit of context, but it's not going to be necessarily revolutionary. You can do document clustering, where you can say, it's kind of a simple way to go through and say, 20% of people are talking about this when we ask them this question, and 30% are talking about that when we ask this question. And you get a kind of a rough idea of where people are on questions. And then sentiment analysis, you can see whether people are saying good things or bad things, positive or negative. Although sometimes that can be kind of worded into the question. If we ask, what do you love about working here? Chances are most of them are going to be positive, and then vice versa. The one that I really like to get into is topic and theme extraction. That's where you take a whole bunch of data, you pull out topics. So words that tend to show up together in different documents. And when I say document, that can be a cover letter, it could be a comment left by someone, but an individual block of text from one author. So this is an example of one that I used. I looked at the 360-degree feedback. We asked the question, what do you appreciate most about this person? And then they leave, 2 or 3 sentences. It says, this person is a great coach to me, or this person's always has great ideas, whatever. And obviously we anonymize the information, but you can go through, and the tool I use can pull out these different topics, that words that all show up together, and then it'll score a 1 or a 0 whether or not that particular comment contained that particular topic or theme. And then that allowed you to do something like this. So one of the questions I was asked was, we tend to have a sticking point in the org structure where people seem to be able to get promoted up to a level 12 or 13, and then people tend to kind of stagnate there a little bit, whereas fewer people are able to break past that and get promoted to L14 and on. And we're actually having to bring in a lot of outside talent at that senior executive level because we don't have enough people in the pipeline. So I looked at what people were saying about those who remain steady at that level 12 or 13 versus those that were able to promote past that and go beyond level 13. And you can see some pretty significant differences between the two populations. You can see inspirational leadership style, thinking through complex issues, growing people, having insightful leadership. So these are not questions that we thought to ask. We probably asked questions similarly, but we just asked the open-ended question of, what do you like most about this person, or what do you appreciate most about this person? And then the respondents to that question kind of gave us the answer, and it kind of is staring right at us, just from mining that rich text information and getting to the result. So the next one I want to talk about is when you're actually in that meeting and you're talking through the results. Now, I've actually given entire presentations on communicating to executives that could probably be summed up in this one slide. And it's basically, don't talk about the process unless they ask. And I say unless they ask because nothing erodes credibility more than someone asking a technical question on your work and not being able to answer it. But those are the details you don't want to lead with. And the way I think about this is, say you're buying a car. You're not interested in the alloy composition of the frame or the tensile strength of the cables used in there. You're worried about, do I like the car? Is it fun to drive? Is it safe? Can I afford it? Those are the kinds of things you're worried about. And it's the same thing with your audience. They're not interested in, well, first I ran this query and to bring together these two data sources, then I identified this as a target variable, and then I ran variable selection to remove some predictors that weren't as predictive. And then I ran two logistic regressions and a decision tree, and the stepwise logistic regression won out because of these. You have by the time you're done with that, you have a room full of people who are looking for coffee, trying to stay awake. So that's not what you want to do. You want to focus on, here's why we're losing people. It's these three factors, and here's what we need to do about it. That will get their attention. That will get them moving. And whatever you do, don't show them stuff like this. And I say that because this is one of the first meetings I had with the leadership. I brought them through some of the code editor and some of the nitty-gritty output. I thought at the time I was going to dazzle them with my brilliance. But looking back, it is pretty cringe-inducing. So now I tend to talk more in headlines and sound bites. And I think headlines are very powerful. For instance, this headline from the New York Times almost 50 years ago. So how many hundreds of thousands, millions of man hours went into making sure the Apollo 11 mission went off without a hitch? That we got 3 human beings from this world to another world and back safely. It's mind-boggling. But almost 50 years later, people don't remember the nuts and bolts of making that rocket go. They remember those 4 words: men walk on moon. And that's what a headline can do for you. Your audience will take those bits of information, they'll stick in their heads, and then as they go about their business, they'll use what you said to inform their decisions. So that's what I try to do whenever I'm presenting this information. And then finally, you want to think about the future. So like I said before, in your first projects, you want to use the data that you already have. You don't need to go through a big process of collecting a whole bunch of extra data. But you do want to start planning for that now. If you have a whole bunch of data that you would like to have but don't have it now, well, this is the good time to get started. Or maybe you have a lot of data in disparate places and you want to get a more streamlined process for bringing them all together. So start talking that strategy now in order to make your projects in the future easier. And then you also want to solve the problems for your future company. I think Wayne Gretzky, famous hockey player, said, "I skate where the puck is going. I don't skate where the puck has been." And that's the same way you want to do your work here. You don't want to solve for the problems you have right now. You want to solve for the future problems. For instance, in our company, we've moved from about 80% of our stores being franchise owned to about 98% of our stores being franchise owned by the end of this year. So in a span of about 5 years, we've made that dramatic transformation. So the leaders we need in this company are going to be different. We're not going to be running restaurants anymore. We need people who are able to market and who are able to maintain those franchise relations. So that's a difference in our organization. The other difference is in the workforce. in under 10 years, there are going to be people entering the workforce that don't remember a time before an iPhone or before the ubiquity of having Google to answer all of life's questions or to have free 2-day shipping. They're going to expect different things from a employment experience. They're going to want a faster, more customized, more tailored experience. And we need to be there to meet them, to keep them engaged, to keep them motivated. On the other hand, so that's a little more challenging, but on the other hand, younger generations tend to be more willing to give up data for the sake of convenience or for the sake for mutual benefit. More people are on Facebook or whatever social media channel. They're more willing to let Google track their movements so they can get traffic data. So that mindset is kind of changing. So it'll be a little bit easier for us as analytics practitioners to get that data about people for mutual benefit. And obviously the analytics techniques and the capability around that continue to evolve as well. So I want to give some final thoughts before we take it to questions. So 10 years ago, like I said, only the biggest, most innovative companies were bringing analytics to their HR functions. Right now, it's still I would consider it a competitive advantage. It's still best-in-class companies have a strong stake in analytics in HR. But in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be do or die. It's not going to be a competitive advantage anymore. If you're not doing it, your competitors will, and they will get better at attracting, retaining, and engaging their employees, and it will impact your bottom line. The good news is there's never been a better time to get out there and get started. There's a lot of resources out there. A lot of vendors are understanding the importance of this area and are putting a lot of investment in there. And then a lot of leadership are understanding the importance of this and are willing to make those investments. And with that, I will open it up to questions. I think Martha.
Thank you. Thank you, David. That concludes the presentation portion of our program today, and we'll now move on to our Q&A. We've gotten lots of great questions, and we'll continue to take your questions for the remainder of the hour. A reminder that you can submit your questions by entering them into the chat box in the lower corner of your console or on Twitter using the hashtag #MITSMREvent. And now onto our first question. An attendee asks, how did you uncover patterns across a very large set of comments? We have a tool to capture employee sentiments daily with open text, and we have a large organization. It presents a data analysis challenge to find meaningful patterns.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if it's a small data set, typically you're going to get the most nuanced view by just reading them. But when you get into 100 or you get into 400 or you get into 10,000, there's simply no way to do that consistently from a human perspective. Even if you spent 2 weeks reading all 10,000 comments, the human brain is not wired to apply the same rules to the first comment that it is to the 10,000th comment. That's where text mining programs really shine. They can look for common words. For instance, without SAS isn't paying me to do this, but I'll share a little bit about the tool that I use. It's called SAS Text Miner, and what it's able to do is it's take several thousand. It doesn't matter how many different comments you have, but it'll go through and it'll look for words that are close enough together, that show up in the same groups together, that are unique enough to be considered a topic. And it'll present you with, say maybe 10 topics or 20 topics, however you decide, and then you can go back through and start to understand how certain comments. And if if you want to understand a little bit more of the context, you can look and see some of the comments that contain that particular topic and see, you get a little more context along that way. That's typically the approach I do. But yeah, when you're dealing with a big data set like that, you simply can't read your way through it and expect to have a meaningful analysis. And there's lots of different tools out there that are getting into that. Again, text analytics is not one that was very popular 5 to 10 years ago, but a lot of companies, a lot of vendors are getting into that space as well.
David, great answer. You actually managed to answer a question that a number of people had asked, which is what tool are you using for text analysis? So great job there. Another question from our audience: what external data do you add, if any?
Well, we have some of the different health and wellness vendors that we have. Sometimes I'll pull in that data. Some of the assessments that we run are housed by third-party companies, whether it's an engagement survey or that executive assessment is run by an outside firm. So I have to talk to them about getting an export from the system. Some of those things we're able to pull in, as long as you can kind of tie them back to an employee with some form of identifier, whether it's an ID or a name. You can kind of connect all of those together. But those are probably the biggest ones that I personally use. We've pulled in a little bit of customer satisfaction data as well. I've done a little work around helping one of the brands with their store level restaurant engagement on their employees. So whenever data is run by a vendor, you typically have to reach out and request that data.
Great. Another person in the audience was interested in your description of unicorn projects and said, can you provide some examples of unicorn projects, which, if I remember correctly, were low effort and high impact in practice?
Yes, that's why I call them unicorns, because you never see them in the wild. They typically only exist in case studies where someone was able to not do that much and be able to produce a significant output. The point I was making there is that for the most part, if you put in a little bit of effort, you're going to get a little bit of a result. And if you put in a lot of effort, you're probably, more often than not, you're going to get a big impactful result. There's plenty of stories out there about companies who put in a lot of effort and it ends up failing. Obviously that's how a project ends up, but that's not how it was originally conceived. So that relationship between effort and value is largely linear, is kind of the point I was making there.
Okay, so you weren't going to come up with any unicorn examples?
No,
okay.
I haven't seen any in the wild.
Okay.
I haven't come across
fair
them.
Enough.
If anyone sees them, by all means, let me know.
Okay, great. Now here's a great question. When hiring HR employees, what skills should you look for if you want these employees to use workforce analytics?
That is a great question. There's not a lot of us around. Actually, to borrow the unicorn phrase again, I was reading in HR Executive Magazine, they were talking about the intersection of the analytics capabilities and HR skills they call them purple unicorns because they're so rare to find. But that doesn't mean you necessarily need a team of HR experts who are also data scientists. A lot of your HR practitioners, you would want them to have a certain amount of familiarity with working with data and have an intellectual curiosity. I think that's really important. Or you could also, a lot of organizations will hire maybe a PhD level statistician or a data scientist to work solely on the HR piece. And then the other HR practitioners can kind of take those results, put some context around them, and then present the well-rounded findings to leadership. So you can kind of go one of two ways: either really hire in some heavy hitter statistician, or you can have a team that of HR experts that exhibit a natural curiosity and propensity to work towards this stuff.
Excellent. Another question from the audience: what is the real impact and what are the real capabilities of artificial intelligence for identifying talent, risk, and competitiveness of a workforce?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that we're not quite there yet. But I would say in the next 5 years, it's going to be super big. It's going to be hot. So one example of where we've used artificial intelligence in the HR space, it's not a talent example, but it is a benefits example. So every year, again, for the international audience, we have a period called open enrollment where employees elect their benefit options, their medical insurance, their dental insurance, their life insurance, all of those things. They make those decisions, and it's always really confusing for the average user, for the average employee, and they usually have to ask a lot of questions. And so we staff an entire call center for that month or two with some temporary employees to answer those questions when they come in. So this year we unveiled a virtual assistant. It was basically like Siri or Alexa or Google, where it would basically walk you through the questions. It's basically, the process was, when my parents asked me to look through their benefit options, I asked the same questions. What are your medical expenses going to look like this year? Do you have any regular prescriptions, or do you have any dependents? Those kinds of questions. And this virtual assistant was asking those same questions and getting people to their recommended benefit options. So not only does that free up some headcount on our call center, but it also it empowers those people who had some questions or weren't quite sure, but it wasn't quite to the level where they wanted to call and sit on hold and go through that whole process. They were able to just go out in their own time, instantaneously get that information. So I think that was a big win for us. I've also heard of other companies bringing virtual assistants into some of the reporting, some of the more transactional stuff. For instance, I forget which company it is, but a big manufacturing company I'd talked to, they were piloting having Alexa on the manufacturing floor, so the floor manager could say, run me my absentee report for the last 2 weeks, and he or she would get that report emailed to them, and then it's kind of an instantaneous thing where they don't have to navigate through menus and stuff to get that information. It makes it a lot easier for them. Then they can make decisions more at the edge, as opposed to getting that information from like a centralized place. So I think that's where AI is going to really play in. It's going to replace a lot of those transactional, those low effort tasks that a lot of people are doing manually right now. And I don't think it's necessarily going to replace people. It might in certain cases, but I think it'll free up a lot of people to think more strategically and do higher level work as well in the HR space, be less transactional.
Great. We have a lot of questions from the audience with people being curious about the tools you're using. Can you tell us about the tools that you're using for doing analytics?
Yeah. So our big data warehouse or our big HR system is Oracle HCM. That houses all of the job data, the talent data, so ratings, goals, all that stuff. That's kind of the primary data source. And then I look at a few other data sources, either from vendors or from other databases. The big tools I use, we're kind of a small team here, so we don't have a lot of power users. But I use SaaS Enterprise Guide, which is kind of a go in and write some code, and I'm kind of old school that way, and do some analysis. And then I use SaaS Enterprise Miner, which can do some of those more powerful data mining techniques, run those decision trees, those logistic regressions, and that's where it does the text mining as well. That document clustering, the topic and theme extraction. It's a pretty powerful piece of software. I've seen some other areas use some more point and click interfaces. I know Tableau is super popular. I know that SAS has a visual analytics tool that does something similar, where you take lots of different data sources and you kind of drop things onto the screen, and it can produce some visualizations and some dashboards that you can kind of send out to people. So if you're not as inclined to code and get into the nitty-gritty with some of this stuff, you can use one of those more visual tools as well. But there's a lot of people getting into this space and maturing as well. One of the other ones I've talked to and learned about was Vizier, where they are kind of a software as a service, where they take all your different data sources and kind of house them together, and then they kind of give you some predefined questions and some drill down capabilities to where you can start running reports and getting some analytics and even some predictive stuff in there as well.
Great. Another question from the audience is, how do you work with executives in other parts of the organization to solve problems that cross organizational boundaries and require data from their domains?
I haven't done a ton of cross-functional. I mean, obviously, when you work with people, you're talking about everyone across the organization. Probably the biggest cross-functional thing I've done was looking at that store level restaurant employee engagement. So that involved talking to the different brands and getting that data because they work with a vendor, and then also getting some customer satisfaction, which was housed by the operations team. So it's just you kind of have to build those relationships. You have to understand, they have to understand what you're doing with the data, and if there's mutual benefit involved. Those are the kinds of things that you have to do. And then there's a lot of influencing as well. For when we, for instance, when we go to the brand leadership team and we tell them, hey, when you hire people, look for these things, you're basically saying, hey, you haven't been doing it right. So you have to be a little more gentle than that. But you kind of have to make that case and influence, as opposed to just kind of laying down the law, if you will. So that's a big piece of this, is communicating your findings so they actually get put into practice. I think that when I got in, I thought that my methodology and my, just for a little bit of background, I came from an actuarial background, so that's all I worried about was methodology and the approach and the assumptions I made. I thought that if you could get all those pieces right, then who was going to disagree with you? Who was, that argument was going to win the day. But I learned quickly that it's a bit more complicated than that, that you have to take into account the emotional pieces of it. You have to take into account the intuition. I don't think any good HR decision is made on data alone. I think it has to come with intuition as well. So that's kind of a long answer to the question, but there's just a lot to consider, and that is a very big piece of it, is that communication and influencing piece.
Great. We have time for one last question. We've gotten a number of questions from the audience about dealing with privacy concerns. One of them is, how do you balance privacy concerns when you're figuring out what new data to collect? How do you make the case that this data needs to be collected?
Yeah, I think that you kind of have to make that case with the employees, that you have to communicate with them, you have to be transparent. They have to know that when they trust you with it, when they entrust you with this data about themselves, what's it going to be used for and how is it going to benefit me? And like I said in the presentation, communicating that value to them, it goes a long way as well to alleviating some of those concerns. That it's not a punitive measure. We're not putting this on your permanent record in order to give us a good reason to fire you. We want you to be happy. We want you to be engaged. We want you to stay with us for a long time. And we want to make sure that we're doing all the right things to make all of that happen. Whether that's giving you resources, responding to employee engagement, or offering courses on things we know to be true about how to get promoted. We know a lot about who gets promoted here. We know what separates those people from others. So being able to come forth with that kind of information too, I think really goes a long way to getting people comfortable with the idea. And then obviously too, people kind of get that HR knows a lot about you. Just by that employment agreement, there are certain things that you agree to let them do. You work on a company computer. You don't use your personal computer. You scan in at the desk with your badge, and they know when you do that and when you don't. So I think there's a certain level of expectation there. But when you go for new stuff, you really have to be super clear to employees about what you're going to do with it and how it benefits them. I think that's the key piece, is just being transparent.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for today's Q&A session. Over the next few days, please look out for a feedback survey we'll send via email. We greatly appreciate your thoughts and opinions. A reminder that a recording of this program and the presentation slides will be available within 3 to 4 business days. And that concludes our program. Thank you for attending, and thank you again to our presenter, David Harcourt, and our sponsor, SAS.